this computer. I think we're recording and we're ready to go.
Excellent. Well, we are officially off and running. Okay, well, welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're joining from. We are here to talk about the future of improvement. This is our first inaugural Spotlight workshop that we want to focus on here. Number one in the series, and today's focus is going to be improvement trends across industries. So just to talk about a little bit of our agenda here. A little bit of housekeeping. For those not familiar with Zoom, we have the Q&A tab that's down here in the bottom. If anything comes up as we're kind of chatting through in the first 30 minutes, we'll be talking about some of the content. Feel free to use that to ask some questions or raise your hand or chat. We're going to do this kind of a little less formal, try to be a little bit more spontaneous as it is our first one. So a little bit of housekeeping has been out of the way. We'll talk a little bit about what we're here to talk about today and why we created this, introduce ourselves a little bit, and then get into the meat of things, right? So improvement across the industries, looking at food and looking at aviation. Ultimately, with our team that we have here from I-Squared and CCG, we wanted to compare and contrast kind of what the different industries can bring and what improvement looks like across all of them. And then talk about where the future is going. What does the future of improvement look like? And then at the very end, we'll do a little bit of wrap up, kind of talk about what's next and open the floor to Q&A. So to talk a little bit about what we're doing from a mission standpoint, we kind of just started discussing through various networks about, what are the different types of things that really drive the industry and what are we trying to do in improvement. There are lots of tools and techniques available out there, and what we wanted to do is really provide some insight and value to everyone and compare and contrast what can be done in existing in industry and what might be in the future to help improve from a lean, agile, and various other framework standpoint. How do we accelerate that? And what are the differences kind of between, specifically in this session, we'll talk about food and flying, if you will. And then a little bit about what's happening next. Today is our first session. Ultimately, we have a couple others on the agenda. The next one would be focused on systems thinking. We'll talk a little bit about demystifying digital transformation, and then eventually get into data, talking about whether or not it's opportunity or waste. So just to introduce ourselves a little bit, myself, I'm Corbin Metz. I'm a managing partner at Coeptus Consulting Group. With Coeptus Consulting Group, we serve industrial manufacturers and service providers and really try to help bridge the gap between organizational performance and technology. Ultimately, a little bit about myself. I've traditionally a mechanical engineer, served in supply chain management, and have about 12 years experience in operational excellence. Originally from St. Louis, Missouri, and currently in Cincinnati, Ohio. And my partner, Chuck, will talk a little bit about his background.
Thank you for the switch over to me, Corbin. I appreciate it. And as like with Corbin here, I'm Chuck Adams. I'm a managing partner of Coeptus Consulting Group. A little bit about myself. Corbin and I both worked at the same company for a while. I come from a very traditional engineering background. I've spent a lot of time performing engineering and improvement, you could say, type of activities across different industries, primarily heavy industries such as aviation and automotive, but I've also done a little bit of food manufacturing, video game design, etc. And after a lot of that, I've also done some consulting work as well, including starting some of my own businesses outside of Coeptus Consulting Group. So that's a little bit about me, and I'd love to pass it over to Eleanor.
Thanks, Chuck. So I'm Eleanor. I'm principal of I-Squared. I-Squared is based in New Zealand. It's a process improvement solutions business, and it focuses on process and system improvement, food manufacturing project support. So I share that in common with Chuck as a background in food, quality systems development, and improvement focused technology solutions. So as I mentioned, I have a background in operations improvement and technical management in the food industry, as well as some experience in the logistics industry as well. So one of the things that we thought would be useful when talking about the future is to also acknowledge where we are today and talk about that, because that can be a useful platform to then start to talk about what's going to change, what are the challenges in it, and also potentially look at how those two industries compare and contrast. So as I've mentioned, I've worked in the food industry for a significant length of time, that being more than 15 years. And like every industry, it has some key features that make it unique. So one of the things about food is that it has food regulatory requirements. So food safety is a key feature of the food industry. Everybody eats. And one of the things you quickly grow to learn as a food technologist is people feel very passionate about food, and you don't want to mess with it. You want to make sure that you make safe food that people are happy with. There are some specific risks around food, including microbiological foreign matter. So for example, metal being in food is really not a good thing, and allergens. And the proliferation of allergens in the last 20 years has been quite significant and becomes more and more of a challenge to manage over time. So why does that matter? Is basically that overlay of regulations means that there's a level of process complexity that's required in order to manage those risks. And it is one of the key features of the food industry that makes improvement potentially more difficult, but also potentially provides some opportunities as well by having to be quite structured. One of the other things about food is that it's perishable. So food typically has a shelf life unless it's canned, but because it has a shelf life, and also because raw materials often come from the other side of the world and there's long lead times, is that really impacts the ability to use a pull system, which is traditionally used as an improvement tool to reduce inventory and overproduction. And that can cause challenges when you're running to a forecast, because you can overmake on some products and undermake on others. And particularly during product development, that can provide a real kind of pain point for the food industry in terms of managing good operational spend on what they choose to make. There are things that can help though. So demand planning is not new, but it's growing, and the use of predictive analytics certainly supports more accurate demand planning, and also having an effective sales and operations planning process, otherwise known as S&OP, can really help as well. So that's two of the features of the food industry so far. Another one that I kind of touched on with the regulatory requirements but was implied is frequent changeovers. So changeovers are a must with most manufacturers, right? Unless they just make one thing. But with the food industry, there's often reasons that needs to be done. And that includes food safety reasons, as in the microbiological load on the line gets too high, so you need to do a clean. And the other reason is maybe you're going from a chocolate product to a vanilla product, and you've got to clean down the line so you don't have brown streaked vanilla product. This can significantly affect machine uptime and consequently productivity. And as we all know too, it's not like production goes up then down and like that. There's also those kind of slow down and speed up times at the start and the beginning. And so that can really be quite a focus in the food industry around improvement, is reducing that changeover time. And one of the other features of frequent changeovers and productivity impacts is that often there's tension between quality and production because they're almost trying to achieve two different objectives. You know, and I've actually worked on both sides, so I kind of have a bit of empathy for how both people might be feeling. But that's where having a really good integrated management system can help make sure that you're kind of optimizing for both, rather than throwing everything at being productive but not worrying about food safety, and vice versa. The other feature, and I think it's really important to talk about this in this presentation, is that the food industry varies considerably in terms of scale. And one of the elements of scale, which is sort of related, is maturity, and particularly for this presentation, data maturity. Some businesses have invested heavily in process automation and measurement, while others are strongly based on old school paper recorded systems where you're recording your settings. In many modern food businesses, there's been a move towards production process measurement, and the Internet of Things has made this much more possible for small businesses to get some of the benefits that typically was only available in SCADA-based systems, which can be hundreds of thousands of dollars to install. So that's a bit of a wrap up around some of the key features of the food industry. I'll now pass on to Chuck.
Thank you, Eleanor. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the aviation industry here to kind of help relate that further on the next slide when we do comparison, more of the heavy industry side of things. So the aviation industry is a different animal compared to some of the other industries like food manufacturing out there, right? So keep in mind that these bullets here are not collectively, they're exhaustive. There's a lot of different factors we need to consider. But to kind of start on the same foot that Eleanor touched on was really around the aviation regulatory requirements. Obviously, due to the fact that loss of life is very much possible in a very catastrophic way, I don't need to go into the finer details of that. There's a lot of regulation and safety requirements required by a lot of different countries. And that creates a lot of complexity when it comes to not only the manufacturing, but maintaining aircraft for service. And so those heavy regulation requirements can be very challenging. Quick notes as an example, a lot of people ask about flying between different countries as an example. Well, if your aircraft has to fly from the US to the UK as an example, not only do you have to get regulatory sign off for the United States, but you also have to have the regulatory body in the UK. It used to be EASA. I don't know what it's going to be now, signing off on that as well. So that can be very challenging when it comes to the operation of aircraft, but also the manufacturing. You got to know where you're shipping it, right? So that can cause issues and something to consider. On the next bullet over here on the longer product life cycle, we're looking at discrete capital equipment type of objects, right? They have very long life cycles and they can last anywhere from 20 to 40 years. I mean, I was just reading an article. They still got B-52s. They're still flying those today. For the US fleet, they've been around for, I want to say 50 years or something, but they're still flying in military. They're still using them. And even in the civilian market, you still have those kind of cases. Because of the longer product life cycle and because of the amount of money that you spend on aircraft, particularly when it comes to commercial aircraft. I mean, you're looking at hundreds of millions of dollars for some of these larger aircraft. The demand isn't so much driven by like shelf life or something so much as that, where you have that pull. It's really business driven demand. People don't make aircraft or they don't make the components that go into that unless there's a buyer in a way. That's usually how that works. They don't, that's why you hear about Boeing and all these other makers having these big order logs, these backlogs, and that's because it's very business driven for demand. Also, the manufacturing risk is higher, but in a different way from something like food, which we'll get into later. Because it's more discrete, it's not so much that you're looking at what am I trying to say here? You're not trying to look at necessarily, oh, is it safe to eat or not, right? You're looking at something at, okay, is this dimension made? Is the part quality good? And that can be very, very complex, depending on what part you're talking about, right? The next area is, cut-ins and retrofits. So because it's so business driven demand in this industry, usually when companies inject a bunch of capital to create a bunch of equipment to make or to maintain fleets of aircraft, you usually don't do a lot of changeovers. It doesn't mean it doesn't happen, but usually large companies will focus one particular line on one particular aircraft or commodity for the aircraft, right? You're not, you could probably tell the difference if you look at a 777 from Boeing versus a 737. They're different sizes, different scales. And so you have to typically make dedicated lines for those aircraft. So when it comes to things like improvement, as an example, a lot of times in larger companies, you can actually find mismatches between best practices and what's happening on one line versus what's happening on the other. There's a lot more disbursement of resources. And then lastly, to touch on the data issue as well. So in the aviation industry, they're getting a lot better. I mean, we can definitely say they're getting much, much better than they used to be when it came to data capture. With that said, though, there's kind of a deep hidden supply chain that a lot of people don't think about. Like a lot of people say when it comes to making a car, making this, these OEMs or original equipment manufacturers outsource a lot of their parts and techniques to a lot of different shops. And that's very, very true in this industry. So trying to get data all the way back through that supply chain can be very, very difficult. And that's compounded a bit further when you talk about maintenance of aircraft, because now, because of the way the regulatory schemes are, manufacturing and maintenance are considered two separate things. And when you start injecting a replacement parts or, hey, this wing had this issue, as an example, having that flow all throughout the industry can be, for people to digest and be able to use as they interact with those assets can be really, really difficult. And lastly, you have to remember with data, aviation is more of at least for the consumer, is more of an experience than a product, right? You don't buy a 737. I mean, yes, you can get a private pilot license and do all that and buy an aircraft. But as far as using it to do business travel, you're not getting a product per se. You're getting an experience. And businesses are utilizing these assets, these aircraft and these components to be able to serve you as the consumer. So that's one last thing to think about as we go into the comparison here on the next page. So now if we take a look at these industries, let's go ahead and do a quick comparison of them and why that matters a little bit. So when you look at something like food, and I am nowhere near, just so you know, Eleanor's caliber when it comes to food manufacturing experience, but I did do some work over at a French fry manufacturing plant, believe it or not. A lot of potatoes, I won't go into it. And what I notice is that on something like that, and in the food industry, it's a much more what we would consider, continuous manufacturing. Typically things are closer together. It's easy to move and follow the line, right? And follow the product through the actual manufacturing process. We would consider it high volume. And I say simple product, not because we think that, a demeaning, oh, it's just a simple thing, it's just food. But in general, food comes out, you eat it, right? We also look at the quality management systems. As Eleanor was talking about, there's a lot of regulation and requirement all over the world in all different countries regarding how food is made. And so making sure that you manage that quality to, make sure that bad things don't happen is really important. It's a very structured, because of the regulation and the QMS and stuff, there's also a lot of more structure change management. And the labor force, because of that, is very, varied. I remember working at the plants when it comes to food, you have a lot of different types of professionals. You have a lot of folks that are doing a little, more sorting or cleaning and stuff, that kind of nature. But then you also have engineers and plant managers toward the top. Now, when we take a look at the aviation industry, it's quite a bit different, much more discrete manufacturing. You have actual, assets and objects that can last 20 or 30 years. It's not being consumed in the traditional sense. Much lower volume in that regard. You do have discrete things that you can pick up and touch. But because of that, it's not a continuous flow. With all the different special operations that can occur with manufacturing aviation components, you can't weld and clean in the same space really that much. Like, you can't do that. So while the manufacturing plants will be a little bit larger in some cases, sometimes they'll be smaller, depends. They'll usually be really, really big, both of them. It's a different type of large. You have different bays. It's not a continuous flow like food. Very complex products. Again, we talked about this. You're the consumer and you're receiving, right, a service, right, of being flown from somewhere, an experience. You're not necessarily learning how to actually fly a 737. It's a very complex product with a lot of different moving parts and just very complex to build and engineer in that regard. But because of the crazy amounts of regulation that aviation also sees, we do have very high expectations around the quality management system, making sure everything's tracked well and correctly, that it meets the blueprint, et cetera. But because of the different types of parts that you do see and the different commodities, et cetera, and because everything's so discrete and spread out, doing change and making improvements can be very, very varied, if that makes sense. What will work on one particular commodity may not work on another commodity, if that makes sense, because it's so spread out in different suppliers and manufacturers. Also, the aviation industry, due to its nature, and we talk about the manufacturing and services sectors, it's a much more highly skilled labor force. The people that you hire typically are licensed in some way. It's actually regulated very heavily. So even the people that are toward the bottom of a supply chain organization are usually very licensed and very rigorously trained. But when we take those and we look at both of them, we can also see that, yes, there's high capital equipment in all of them. The amounts of money you spend to make food in a manufacturing environment, as well as discrete manufacturing aviation, very expensive, very time consuming. Also, both of the industries are trying to get better when it comes to flow data between different entities in different areas of the firm or outside the firms. And lastly, the frameworks that we have for improvement inside the food industry can be just as applicable to aviation industry, whether that's Lean or Six Sigma. It's more about how you try to apply it is a little bit different. We put that at the bottom. Industries may be different, but the type of manufacturing, whether continuous, discrete, et cetera, will determine your strategy about how you go about making improvements. That's about all I have on this slide. I mean, Eleanor, do you have anything to comment?
No, I think it covers it. One of the things that kind of occurred to me as we were talking was that you've got food as in the process and the product, but actually there is quite a bit of complexity in terms of the manufacturing equipment. So you'd know that as an engineer, that actually some of the equipment used to make continuous product can have all those maintenance requirements, and it may not be to the same scale as the aviation industry, but it kind of occurred to me as we were talking to it that that's actually a similarity that sometimes I guess can get missed, right, in terms of when we think about food or when we think about improvement. And so within the food industry, we actually might need different strategies for improvement depending on what part of the factory or the process we're talking about. So yeah, I think I think you've covered it well.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, and I can just, as a very quick echo, you're absolutely right. The factory that I had worked at for a bit, as an example, doing French fries, it was over 500,000 square feet. I don't know what that is in square meters off the top of my head. I'm sorry, but I was responsible for working with maintenance staff over there, and I think we had over, I want to say, at least 50 maintenance staff, and that's all they did. They just fixed the equipment. They were electricians. Maintaining all that equipment was very, very important and expensive. You had to maintain it. So we had those people there. So that's kind of just a quick comparison between the industries. I'm now going to hand it over to Corbin to really look at the future of improvement.
So this slide I'll talk to, and then Corbin, you'll do the next one, right?
Oh, that's right.
So we are now going to talk about the future, which is, I guess, we've created the series and something that we're all really excited about. And just a little thing to touch on is that the reason that we decided to do this series together was we're both really excited. Well, we're all really excited about where technology can take us in terms of improvement. So, but we did think it was important to kind of build that platform of where are we today, and therefore now where are we going? So there is high potential, and I guess that's why we're excited about it, is because there is the ability to take advantage of new and more available data technology. So it's becoming more possible basically every day. Industry 4.0 is upon us, although, honestly, not every food manufacturing company is in a position necessarily to take advantage of that just yet. But it is enabling businesses to provide insight to production performance through connected machines, processes, and systems. And the next iteration, which Chuck actually introduced me to, is Industry 5.0, which I'd heard the term cobots and, about robots that help support humans basically to do the work. But it's really about refining that collaboration between humans and machines. So it sounds wonderful, doesn't it? Like, it really sounds like there's so much for us to take advantage of and move forward with, but there are some considerations. And I guess that's true of everything. So the move to greater technology is going to have, like I say, a few considerations. And one is technical debt. So technical debt is the idea that certain necessary work gets delayed during the development of software project in order to hit a deadline. And I think this is really relevant as systems move more to data platforms, or they have disparate data systems, there is a need to invest in making sure that those systems interact well, and making sure that, we're not kind of kicking the can down the road continuously in terms of putting in that infrastructure and that support. But it is a temptation, and it's human nature to kind of do what we need to do in order to start getting going. So I think that's going to continue to grow as a challenge for businesses. And one of the things that we wondered about, and I'm kind of on the fence about, but I thought I'd still bring it up, is economies of scale. So we know that IT doesn't tend to be too cheap, and having people that know how to use it, and like software engineers, database engineers, they typically don't come cheap, right? So, you might be working with a consulting company and getting digital transformation done. But one of the things that I've seen and that I really like is now there's also this move towards software as a service and cloud-based solutions, which means that the smaller food manufacturers or smaller businesses do actually get a look in terms of taking advantage of having connected machines, processes, and systems. And one of the things that I get to use in my job is Power BI. And one of the things that's so cool about technologies like Power BI is that it's taking disparate data with very little code and enabling you to get insight. And so that's a real trend, I guess. So economies of scale is an interesting one, because I think scale can both help and hinder big businesses in terms of a digital transformation. One of the things, and the last point, trust in internal procedures, has a bit to it. So good IT, good business analysis requires an understanding of how both the physical and the IT systems interact. And then, of course, the layer on top of that is then how people interact with those systems as well. It is challenging, and it's challenging too with legacy systems. If you're not working with Greenfield and you're having to work out how you're going to make all these things work in the future. Overlay that also with ever increasing speed and pace of change. It makes managing these systems quite difficult at times. And technology is interesting because it both kind of adds to the demands and the speed of pace of change, but it actually also supports. And I think too, really what we all want sometimes deep down, and I might be speaking out of turn, but is some level of certainty in business. But what we're increasingly seeing is that that's quite difficult to do. However, as an improvement person, I can't get away from the feeling that process standardization and management remains important in order to be able to really capitalize on the technology solutions that are coming our way. So part of that is trust. So trust in the data and information becomes more important, especially as machine learning and predictive analytics are used more and more. This involves trusting the machine. And it means that high quality information needs to be used to make the predictions. So we all know rubbish in equals rubbish out. And it also speaks to a need for training and change management processes around technology. And, you know, when we were talking about the food industry, we were talking about a varied workforce. And so there's people that may not be digital natives that are being asked to work in quite different ways in the future. And so that's really something where we've got to foster a feeling of trust towards the information that we're getting, but we've also got to give people a bit of a framework in terms of how to use it so that they feel comfortable or as comfortable as they can. And so really one of the key points for me was that the future of improvement involves technology for sure, but it also involves people, and really determining your business system and kind of taking into account all of the considerations we've talked about today is really key in terms of future improvement. All right, so now we'll hand over to Corbin.
Yeah, thank you, Eleanor. I think you really hit the nail on the head in saying that our technology and our people really need to kind of jive and mesh with each other and kind of come together in that framework that really is a two-way conversation. Ultimately, when you're talking about trying to accelerate what that improvement looks like, we kind of started in comparing and contrasting the food and the flying industry, looking at kind of what those foundational things would look like and kind of referencing things like Hosch and Conry, which are from the lean principles. That foundation is really understanding your data and how do you manage it and what are the areas of opportunity or waste associated with some of that data. Ultimately, once you understand kind of that foundational level, you can then take it one step further and kind of climb up the pyramid as we have it kind of shown here into digital transformation, ultimately changing kind of what your process is and how it works for your business, adding in a little bit more value, taking away that waste, and really trying to improve your analytics and be more proactive and productive with some of the information based on that data foundation. Understanding that framework then and taking it one step further is really what we're calling systems thinking. It's that high level understanding of a cohesive network that has technology and people that all kind of work together independent of silos, or rather without silos, trying to then accelerate kind of what you're able to see when you're able to see it, that just-in-time information, the reduced cost of waste that you would no longer have available to you, and then really allowing the business to perform at its finest. Ultimately, the information is kind of flowing from the bottom up. If you can see here in the yellow little arrows, I guess I would call them. And then ultimately the strategy is kind of flowing down in the orange. And cohesively looking at that together, we think is a really excellent tool and technique that you can use to help accelerate what improvement looks like for you and your business. Ultimately, that's all I had on this slide. I didn't know if you guys had any other comments on that before we kind of talk about what's happening next. Did you have anything else to add? Okay.
I mean, I can go ahead quick. No, I really like what you said, Corbin, about informing from the top down and from the bottom up. A lot of times there's two things I think to consider when it comes to large organizations. And well, Corbin, we came from a very large one, which I'm sure you understand that
Yep.
there is a disconnect that we have found a lot, especially in larger or enterprises, between the strategy and what happens on the ground floor. I know that sounds very cliche because it's talked about quite a bit, but it's more than just the people part. It's also the data part, knowing what's available and seeing everything as a full system. So there's that vertical issue. And then there's also that horizontal issue, which you touched about as well, which is something that organizations really need to consider. Siloing. It's hard because on one hand, you want to specialize a little bit from a labor standpoint when we talk about the people part because of productivity, right? And so you create these silos of these different departments, as you see in companies. But then what becomes of that is as these departments get larger and larger, you have this siloing that ends up unfortunately becoming a siloing of information and data, et cetera. So that when it comes to that systems thinking of what the enterprise is actually trying to do, right, to serve their customer, there can be disconnects between those, you know, waiting on emails to be answered, et cetera, needing that info. So that's all I had to add. Eleanor, anything else?
No, I mean, I think it's quite interesting looking at how when you add new technology, in a way, the fundamentals of what works from an improvement perspective actually doesn't change that much because we're still talking about people and process and systems. And it's just, it adds another flavor to it, I guess.
Yeah. Okay.
So ultimately, what we wanted to focus on today was obviously the different trends across the industries and how improvement can influence that. Ultimately, our next series that's scheduled on the calendar is a systems thinking. So we'll be talking about that next. And then as you can see, we have digital transformation and data also coming in the future. So I think at this time, we'll probably open up the floor to Q&A. If anyone has anything, feel free to use the little Q&A button at the bottom of your screen here, highlighted, and you can put some questions in there. We'll feel free to spend the remainder of the time. I know we went a little bit over here, so we probably have another 5 or 10 minutes we could probably offer for any of those questions. And if not, we'll probably wrap up from here. I will say before we kind of go into the Q&A that following this webinar or workshop rather, you'll be receiving a survey. We would kindly appreciate if you could fill that out and send us the feedback. We obviously focus on continuous improvement here and would love to learn more about how we can add more value in our next series.
Great. So let's see here. Well, we'll give a little bit of time in case anybody does want to ask a question or, you know, and receive an answer for whatever, you know, they need. So Eleanor, I wanted to ask you something I thought was really interesting. You were talking about, you know, trust quite a bit, right? In one of the slides. And I know that, I think it was more focused on I saw the internal processes, you know, and that focus of looking internally. But one of the subjects that we've also been thinking about as well, at least in the aviation industry, is trust between different parties, external parties. What has your experience been on that when it comes to data and trust with the food industry? I mean, does that happen a bit where you have that information flow externally? And you know what I mean?
Yeah, it actually does. So one of the things that is done in New Zealand, which is it's a mixed bag, but some of the supermarkets give the ability for suppliers to actually supply to what's scanned at the checkout. So rather than them making an order and them supplying 10 bags of bread to Countdown down the road or whatever it is, they actually go, we have this many scans over our checkout per week. So you need to work out with your shelf life and with your credits, actually how many you need to supply and when they need to come in. So essentially they're like, we're just real estate and we have a certain rate that we're going to sell your product through it, and you need to manage that. And I thought that was really cool. Like it has some consequences, particularly in short shelf life product. You can spend a lot on credits because the product basically expires before someone purchases it. But that's an interesting move towards more of a pull system, and potentially provides some real opportunities for businesses to actually follow more of a lean approach to supermarket supply.
Okay. Well, thanks. That's very interesting. I always thought about that. I'm like, point of scan, right? Or the scary thing, Amazon, at least in Seattle, where I'm from originally, now you like go into stores, right, and pick something up and it tracks you walking out with it. That's pretty instantaneous. That data.
Yeah, I mean, they have talked about that in the supermarket industry as well, as kind of doing eye tracking and seeing where people are looking on the shelf. And also, you can use that for marketing and working out optimization of what goes where on a shelf and what's going to basically sell the most for your real estate. I mean, it really is kind of, there really is the ability to kind of technify a lot of the retail experiences that customers have, because there's also potentially like a privacy and trust issue to that as well. So it's quite interesting.
Yeah, interesting. Let's see here. I don't know if we have any questions right now. Anything else, Corbin, Eleanor?
I don't see any open questions that have been submitted currently, but I do find it really interesting kind of comparing and contrasting how similar the industries are when it comes to the frameworks and improvement, even though you have completely different products coming out the other side. So it's pretty, I mean, it's just kind of cool, right?
Yeah.
For nerds like us, at least, it's very cool.
No kidding. All righty. Well, if there's no other open questions, we can go ahead and call it. But we want to thank everybody for attending today. It was absolutely great and having fun doing this. And thank you, Eleanor and Corbin, for joining. It was really great to all come together and just talk about this subject and compare and contrast, and just looking forward to the next few series. And like Corbin said, we'll be sending out a follow-up, and we appreciate everybody's time for listening in. So
yeah, if you go to the next, there's a next slide, isn't there, Chuck, where it's got contact details. So also feel free to reach out to us if you want to have a chat, ask any questions that you don't want to ask right now, or you think of something afterwards. Please get in touch. We're happy, like Corbin said, we're big nerds, so we're definitely happy to talk about anything to do with improvement in technology. But hand back over to you, Chuck.
All right. Well, thank you for bringing that up, Eleanor. And if you need anything, please just reach out to us. We to the nerds, I guess that's what we call ourselves. All righty. Everybody have a great rest of your day, and cheers, and see you on the next one.
Cheers. Take care. Happy weekend.